He watches you from the shadows. He follows your every step. He haunts your soul. He is .exe. And so our story begins long ago, back when the overworld was nothing more than just a freshly created dimension within the Minecraft universe, devoid of life. Well, that was with one exception, that being the creator of this grand world, otherwise known as the overworld spirit. Now, this spirit was an omnipotent being, and so he possessed enough power to do anything, and thus, for that reason, he soon created life within his world. However, after spending years developing these life forms into rather complex beings, he faced a problem. That being that none of these life forms on the surface of his world were powerful enough to comprehend him. And so, for that reason, he felt rather lonely, as he had no one to talk to. However, that would not be a problem for too long, as after all, the overworld spirit had unlimited powers, and so he could just create something that would be able to comprehend him. And so the overworld spirit spent the next few minutes pulling out code from the air and solidifying it and infusing it with a fraction of his powers, and thus he brought to life a demigod, and he called this brand new coded creation subscribador.exe. And he was perfect, as he was powerful enough to interact with him, as he had a diluted version of his powers. But he was also weak enough that he would not cause the overworld to become unstable. It was amazing. And so it would be over the next few million years that he, along with the overworld spirit, would grow a very close bond, as they spent every single day together, talking and interacting with one another, as the overworld grew and flourished to become what we know and love today. And so all was good for the two of them, as they were living in the best world in the entire universe, and they were both very happy. However, very soon, things were going to change, as it was on just one normal sunny morning that the duo were travelling across the desert, looking out for glitches, when subscribador.exe decided to play a little prank on his friend, as he decided to summon a giant orb of jack-o'-lanterns filled with flying mobs and giant mobs and minuscule players and all sorts of other weird creations right in the center of that desert. As after all, it was the spooky season, and this was going to be his little trick. However, when the overworld spirit saw this, he was not impressed. Instead, he was rather annoyed, as this mission that they were on was very important, because if they missed a glitch because of these foolish antics, well then, trillions of lives would suffer greatly. And so, disappointed with his actions, the overworld spirit knew that to avoid anything like this ever happening again, well, he had to end his friend. And so with that, the overworld spirit lunged at subscribador.exe, and in just one hit, he was dead. Now, that sounds rather cold, calculated, and evil, but really, to the overworld spirit, this was the best way to solve that problem. Besides, the millions of years that he had invested into gaining this friendship was almost nothing to him, as time was meaningless for him, as it was unlimited. And so those millions of years were nothing more than just a few seconds for him. Also, he had the power to create a brand new companion quite easily and quite quickly. And so, subscribador.exe was rather meaningless to him. And so, after ripping out every coded fiber that he was made of, the overworld spirit just moved on, like nothing had happened. However, little did he know, he messed up badly, as while a majority of subscriber.exe was killed, there were just a few lines of code that remained even after the overworld spirit had attempted to annihilate him. And so, those lines of code were then able to grow, and in just a few days, they were able to regenerate into a brand new form. Now, this new form was made entirely from duplicated code, which was clearly visible. But also, none of this code was meant to exist, and so it was corrupted code, and thus, for that reason, the eyes and the inside body of this new form glowed in a dark red hue. But also, as this new form was only created from a fraction of the original being, the power levels and consciousness of this new being were also only a fraction of the original being. And so for that reason, this new being was no longer subscriber.exe. No, instead it was just .exe. But .exe had luckily retained enough of his previous powers to still be likely the most powerful being on the surface of the entire world at that time, with the exception of the spirit. However, .exe knew that he couldn't use all of his powers too overtly, because if he did that, well, then the spirit would find him and he would be killed. But still, .exe wanted to use his powers to get revenge on that spirit that he genuinely believed was his friend, that had brutally betrayed him. And luckily, he knew exactly how he could get his revenge, while also not exposing his location to the spirit, as he decided from that moment onwards that he was going to use his powers to subtly annoy the spirit, as he was going to dedicate his life to haunting the overworld. But he was going to do it in such a way that it would be impossible to get it back to him. And so with that in mind, .exe then began to play wither sounds very loudly all across the world, all in random locations, in an attempt to scare as many entities as possible. And well, it worked, as the villagers, when they heard that demonic sound, quickly went insane, because not everyone heard those sounds. And so when the ones that did hear it went to tell the others what they had heard, none of them believed them, as it just sounded wrong for there to be such a strange sound. And so because of that, those other villagers were exiled for being crazy, and they soon died. But after that, he then haunted another set of beings with the exact same wither sounds. And so this time, understanding that it wasn't due to craziness, millions of villagers and illagers alike started to pray to the overworld spirit, begging for these demons to be released from the world. Now, this annoyed the overworld spirit, as he now had to deal with millions of villagers and millions of villagers every single day begging for the removal of something that he wasn't causing. And it wasn't coming from a glitch either. However, luckily, this annoyance for the overworld spirit didn't last too long, as soon all entities within the world got used to this occasional wither sound, and they just moved on with their lives. Now, this did put a slight dampener on the mood of .exe, as his goal was to annoy the spirits as much as possible for as long as possible, and the illagers and the villagers were just moving on. But really, that was all okay, as .exe had so many other ideas of how he could annoy the entire world, as after all, he was a demigod, and he did possess many powers. And so, it was a mere few months after all the entities were used to these demonic wither sounds that he began to summon thousands of hordes of husks in places where they were not meant to be. From woodland mansions to snowy villages to dirty swamps. And well, doing this caused far more stress to the world than those wither sounds ever did, as millions of entities were suddenly exposed to a regional mob that they were never meant to see. And so because of that, many began to believe that this was it. This was the end of the world as they knew it, as these strange zombie-like beings were starting to invade their homes. And so because of all that, chaos suddenly erupted within the world, as the villagers began to burn their mansions down in hopes that the overworld god would save them. And the villagers began to kill their young, thinking that that might save them. Now, this wasn't the end of their world, but due to their reaction, the overworld spirit had quite a lot of work to do, as he had to kill millions of husks to save his world and save the civilizations within it. Now, luckily, this was quite easy to do, as it only took one simple command. However, .exe was fully aware that his ex-friend would likely act in that way, and so for that reason he waited for a few more days to pass before he released millions more husks throughout the world. Except these husks were different, as each of these husks had a unique mob ID, and so for that reason it would be impossible to kill them all in just one simple command. No, instead they would all need to be killed individually. Now, that was evil. And so, once all those husks were out there in the world, just like last time, chaos erupted. Only now, everyone was convinced that they were going to die in just a mere few days, as they didn't think that they would survive 2 zombie attacks. And so, as all entities within the world began to face their own mortality, they all began to go insane. Now, this annoyed the overworld spirit quite a lot, as the subjects were regressing as species right now, which was a very bad thing for the overworld spirit, as if they went back far enough, well, he could die. But luckily for him, once again, everything was all good, as the overworld spirit, even though it was a hassle, was able to kill all of those evil husks in just a few days. And once they were all gone, all the entities within the world calmed down, and they all went back to normal. Also, rather interestingly, this annoyance that the overworld spirit had just experienced actually helped him, as due to the fact that each of these mobs had unique IDs, he was able to discover what was causing all of these strange events, as these were not glitches. No, they were the work of .exe. And so the overworld spirit was quite angry when he figured that out, as he truly did believe that he had killed his friend, as after all, he was all powerful, and so he shouldn't have survived. And worse than all that, he couldn't detect him, as he was using just such little power that he was invisible to him. And so because of that, the overworld spirit decided to send him a sign that only he would be able to see. And thus, the overworld spirit placed a hologram of his head onto the sun. Now, for the next few days, .exe did not see this hologram of his ex-friend, as he just continued to travel the world, attempting to cause even more chaos. However, on one sunny morning, when he was just standing by a river, he looked up at the sky, and well, he was horrified to see his ex-friend. And he knew that this vision was something that only he could see, as no other being in the entire world was able to comprehend the spirit. Oh no, this was bad, as if he was sending out this message, then the overworld spirit must have learned of his existence, and so fearing that he was close to being caught, .exe quickly shapeshifted into a pig, and he made the decision to temporarily put a halt on his spread of chaos and annoyance through the world. And thus it would be over the next few days that .exe, in the form of a pig, lived like a normal pig, as he spent his days rolling around in the mud, eating wheat, and playing with the other pigs. But as he was doing all that, he constantly looked up at the sky, only to see his friend over and over and over again staring at him. Now, he was quite scared by that, but thankfully, after a few months, the face slowly disappeared. And well, once that happened, .exe finally felt safe. But still, he remained hidden in the form of that pig for the next few decades, fearing that the overworld spirit was just waiting for him to make a move. However, very soon, things were about to change, and .exe's life would never be the same, as it was on one dark, rainy night, while .exe was just travelling through a flowering meadow, that he saw something. It was a Steve. Now .exe was in complete shock when he saw that Steve, as he knew what they were and what their story was, but he hadn't actually seen one in well over 10,000 years. And so he began to follow that Steve to see what he was doing, while also thinking what he should do with that Steve. And well, over those next few hours, he quickly figured out what he needed to do. And well, he decided that he needed to hunt and stalk that Steve, because Steves are the most powerful entities in the overworld, excluding spirits. And so if he could hunt that Steve and cause great annoyance to him without him ever learning that he was causing any of this, well then he would be ready, in his mind, to go back to haunting the rest of the world and annoying the overworld spirit once again. And so with that, .exe then began to stalk the Steve. Now, as that Steve travelled across the world, going across rivers and mountains and deserts, he just felt off. Like something or someone was watching him. But he couldn't prove that that was the case. And so he just kept moving, thinking that he was just feeling like that because he hadn't slept enough. But still, after having several consecutive nights of long and peaceful rests, he still felt like he was being watched. It was weird. And so for that reason, he began to walk into a village, thinking that he could go and ask them about these strange feelings. However, a few days later, when he arrived in a village and began to talk to the villagers, they all just dropped dead, and some of their houses just randomly exploded. Oh no, this was wrong, all wrong, and the Steve knew that something or someone was definitely stalking him. But still, he didn't know who or what was doing that. And so that only added to his fear, and thus he began to run. Yes, this was exactly what .exe wanted. And so it was then that .exe followed the Steve as he began to run out of that village, screaming for help. And so, over the next few months, the Steve tried everything to lose his stalker, but nothing worked, as .exe was always there. Be it in the form of a bee, or a cow, or a fish, it didn't matter. He was always watching from the shadow, following every step. And well, this got to a point where the Steve was so scared that he was even willing to go to a woodland mansion, as he began to think that maybe the evil villagers might pity him and would be willing to help him. And so for that reason, Steve began to traverse his way across the world until, just a few months later, he had found it. A woodland mansion. Now normally, he would have been terrified of that structure, but not today, as he ran right through the front doors, and he began to beg the illagers to help him. However, before the illagers could respond to him, they all dropped dead. And then thousands of axolotls came out of nowhere, replacing them. Wait, what? How was this happening? The Steve just didn't know what to do, and so he just stood there, paralyzed with fear. But then, after a few minutes, he realized that standing there wouldn't achieve anything, and so he began to run out of that mansion. However, just as he got out, he was teleported right back into the heart of that mansion, and whenever he tried to move from that moment onwards, he would just be teleported back. And then it began to thunder within that mansion, and then lightning began to strike down all around him. And then, just a few seconds later, .exe finally revealed himself. And so, he then began to walk towards the Steve, picking up a totem as he came forward. This was it, he thought. This was the creature that had been hunting him, and he was going to die, as he couldn't get away, because whenever he tried to move, he was just teleported right back. He was doomed. And so the Steve tried to get out his swords and was ready to try and fight that monster. However, as soon as he did that, .exe lifted up his hand, and the Steve sword suddenly turned to slime. Oh no. This was bad. And so before he could comprehend what had just happened, .exe lunged at him, and in just one light tap, he was dead. But that wasn't the end of his story. No, because just as his deceased body began to fall to the ground, .exe lunged at it, and he absorbed it into his totem. This was great for .exe, as he now had all the practice that he needed for him to be comfortable going back to the overworld, causing worldwide chaos and annoyance once again. And so with that, he then ran out of that mansion and was ready for his greatest prank yet on the world, which would cause more annoyance and chaos than anything that he had done before. However, before he could do that, a storm suddenly developed over the sunny sky of the dark forest, and then everything began to shake. This was wrong. He wasn't doing this, and then everything began to glow, and then it all stopped as the overworld spirit had arrived. He had found him. Oh no. And so .exe began to run as fast as he possibly could to get away from him. However, he was quickly cornered by that spirit. He knew that this was it. This was his end. And his reign of annoyance and chaos over the world was coming to a close. But then he saw it. Just behind the spirit was a ruined portal, and that gave him an idea. And so, using some of his powers, he fixed that portal in just a few seconds, and then he jumped over to it, dropping that totem as he ran. And he was able to get into that portal and move to the next dimension, all before he was forcefully teleported back to the spirit. And so he was safe now, as the overworld spirit couldn't get him here in this new world. And so, for that reason, all he had to do was to just wait it out for a while. And maybe he could spend his time practicing haunting this world, and thus growing his haunting skills even further before returning to the overworld. But wait, before any of that happens, we need to go back to the overworld, as .exe's effects weren't over just yet. As that totem, the one fused with the blood and body of the dead Steve, well, when .exe dropped it, it fell deep into a cave, and it ended up landing in an ancient city. And after that, well, something happened. More specifically, something that would affect trillions, no, quadrillions of innocent lives. But to learn of the tragic tale of what happened next due to that totem, well then, you'll need to watch this video